Devotion to God means living for Christ. In 2 Corinthians 5 and 15, he says that He died for all, that those who live should live no longer for themselves, but for Him who died for them and rose again. This passage gives us deep insight into baseline human nature. What is the base level of human nature? I want. Living for self. That's our baseline point of reference. Some have tried to label that in ways that are a little bit more flattering or a little bit less ugly to try to make it sound better, looking out for number one, survival of the fittest and all that kind of language. But it boils down to living for myself. And he says Christ died for us so that we wouldn't have to live that way, so that instead we could live for Him. Because the greatest, deepest, most meaningful human sacrifice or human satisfaction comes not in living for ourselves, but in sacrificing of ourselves to live for something greater. And in the case of Christianity, that something greater is someone greater, Jesus Christ. And the very nature of His sacrifice for me invites me to reciprocate in sacrifice for Him. It's basic human decency. If you're married, perhaps you will surely understand this illustration. The other day I was thinking a lot about this. I have a good wife. Those of you who know my wife know she's a wonderful woman. She's very good to me. She's very loving. I'm very thankful for her. The other day I just got to thinking about, the last few days there's all these things she's done to try to please me, and this is just amazing. This is good stuff. I could get used to this. She just kept on, and about the time I thought she had run out of soap, she did something else nice for me. That's great. And then it hit me. What does decency demand? Decency demands that I step up to the plate and try to do something special for her. I really went out of my way one day. I took my dirty dishes to the sink, and then I took my dirty clothes on the floor and threw them in the hamper. I had to rest after that. Sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? What does decency demand? That I think about what she likes, what matters to her, what's sort of her language of affection, in a way that I could in some way reach out and have a touching interaction with her wherein she feels my love and she's thinking about how fortunate she is that I'm there at the house, not just consuming, but giving. So I tried to apply myself to that. Because love, properly understood, is inspiring and motivating. And if we can't look at the cross and be inspired and motivated, we're not looking at it right. A mature mindset will see that and see duty. It'll see, you know what, He's done something for me. I want to do something for Him. I want to be the kind of person that wants to repay that. So we live for Christ. And living for Christ, we live with Christ in us. As Paul worded it in Galatians 2:20, I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. In the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God who loved me and gave Himself for me. Paul is describing the character here of a person who loves God with all their heart, soul, and mind. This is a total devotion to God. He's crucified with Christ in his daily walk, in his manner of life, in his moment-by-moment conscientious choices. He's crucified with Christ. However, he continues to live on. Though that fleshly, selfish person is dying moment by moment, there is a spiritual life and vitality that's thriving within him. That throbbing heart that beats on in love for God. Living a life in the flesh by faith of the Son of God. Motivated by what? By the fact that He loved me and gave Himself for me. That's devotion to God. Devotion to God leads to other things. Devotion to God does not stop at, well, I really like all that He's done for me. Well, I have this really warm emotional feeling for God. That is not the end of devotion to God. That's the beginning. Proverbs 9 and 10 says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the holy is understanding. The psalmist wrote that he was devoted to fearing God. We talked about that devotion, you see, to that relationship expressed in terms of love, devotion. And here he teaches that a person that has that kind of relationship with the Lord, what is that? That's not the end, that's the beginning of wisdom. There are other things that will follow, things that walk in cadence with the notion of godly wisdom. So, this devotion to God leads us to other things. It leads us to be devoted to His church. And that is a devotion that reflects itself in our collective activities, and that reflects itself in our personal involvement. Not just what we do together as a congregation of God's people, but what we individually do in our service to God. But that devotion to God also leads us to devotion to our families. And that is expressed in terms of the influence we have on our families that directs them towards God. Because devotion to family that makes you take your family and, oh, well, I'm devoted to these guys, we're going to go do all these things that everybody likes, and then that, in effect, pulls them away from God, that's not being devoted to your family. That's torpedoing your family. That's destroying your family. It may look like fun, it may look like devotion on the outside, but in reality, it's destructive.